John, we're live. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Rich. How are you doing, man?
Better than I deserve. That's my tagline, brother. Better than I deserve. I think I
It
stole it from
is.
Dave Ramsey.
Yeah, I've been doing Dave since about 2001. He's done me right so far.
So did I. That's yeah, I think 2000 or 2001. Me and my lovely bride, Miss Lisa, got on the Dave Ramsey program, and we got out of debt, and we're still out of debt today. So shout out to Dave Ramsey.
Yeah, he does good stuff.
Yes, he does. Yeah, he's one of those guys that some people don't like the messenger, but like get beyond the messenger, man. If he ruffles your feathers, it's the message that's important, and every American needs to hear it. We got Will,
Absolutely.
yeah, we got Will Rhodes jumping on. Says good morning. He's out there in Missouri. Coin number 2269. If you want to find out if becoming a coined member of our self-preservation community is the right decision for you and your family in these very bizarre times, then I encourage you to click the links in today's show notes. Take 14-day free trial. Mr. Mike Seeklander and I, we've got everything from white belt to blue belt Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu led by Christian Dare, John Jock Machado, black belt, Dr. Dan Alls, Nikki teaching medical. We got the former special operators from Atomic Athlete teaching you Warrior One fitness inside the training vault. We got handgun, low light, shotgun, rifle, preparedness series. We got everything to keep you and your family safer. Please like and hit that share button. Let's talk about a couple things real quick before I read John's bio and we get into today's show. This is round 2, I believe, with you, John. Maybe
It
3.
is. I was going to throw up my coin. You never know who's going to show up in the society. I didn't make it into the triple digits, but I'm 1186 on my coin number.
Wow, that's still pretty young there. Always good to talk to a fellow member of our community. One of the warrior members of our community, Dr. T.C. Fuller, wrote this really awesome book. It's won a Bibb Award, and if Dr. Fuller shows up this morning, explain what that is. No Safe Alternative: Improving How We Teach Cops to Kill. You want to check? It's probably too late to pick that up for someone's stocking stuffer, but oh, there you go. But yeah, so please like and hit that share button. John Shriver is on, and without much further ado, I'm going to read John's bio, and we'll get into today's show. John Hearne has been a federal law enforcement officer since 1992 and a firearms instructor since 2001. John has been a staff instructor for Tom Gibbons and Rangemaster Firearms Training Services, traveling the country and teaching firearms for armed citizens, law enforcement agencies, and military units. John has over 1,500 documented training hours from the most respected training institutions and trainers such as GunSite, Thunder Ranch, Rogers Shooting School, Viking Tactics, Paul Howe, Masaad Ayoob, Ken Hackathorn, Larry Vickers, Louis Awerbuck, and many, many others. He has firearm instructor credentials from FLETC, FBI, NRA, and Paul Howe, CSAT, and Tom Gibbons, Rangemaster. Very impressive, John. Good morning. Welcome, brother.
Thank you for having me. I hope I just don't disappoint too much. It almost sounds like I'm respectable or something.
Yes, you definitely are respectable. Well, I'm wearing a turtleneck in honor of your appearance this morning. I'm trying to class it up a little bit over here, John.
I at least wore a collared shirt. I can only save the sports coats for the official webinars, but
And I've attended one of
sometimes it's
those
part of the plan.
webinars, and it was outstanding, brother. Where can folks? I know I want you to. I'm going to throw a link in later, but where can folks train with you as far as your webinars? Are you doing them anymore?
So yeah, oh no, I've got one scheduled in 6 days. I'm doing basically the update. I do that crime seminar at the end of December every year, so I'll be running that again December 28th. Probably the best place to find my stuff is I do have a website, but it's kind of still being built out. But if you just go to jhearne.eventbrite.com, there's tickets for that online webinar. It's like $25 for the seat. It runs a little bit over 2 hours, and the recording will be available for at least 30 days after that initial running. And it's just a recap of what crime is doing national trend wise, as well as giving some people an insight into the criminal mind and the types of criminals that are out there so that they can better prepare.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I wanted to tap into today. Some of that, and then, like I told you in the email the other day, then if we could take it from the crime trends and then make the leap to the cognitive pistol stuff that you're doing recently, thinking with a handgun in your hand. I think that's fantastic.
Absolutely. Let's go.
Because that's I've watched that movie 6 Days. I don't know if you've seen that. It's the one about the Iranian hostage siege that the SAS did back in England.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, fantastic movie. And that one of the things that says, to be an assaulter basically is what they're getting at here is you need the heart of a lion and the brains of a judge. And I'm like, yeah, I don't disagree with that. What do you think?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. It's funny you mentioned that because I've been doing the training thing for a while. The most surreal experience I have ever had was I was teaching up at the Indiana SWAT Officers Association. I do a lot of classroom stuff, and they had a guy that was supposed to be teaching concealed carry for law enforcement, and he had a family emergency, and like I literally got an hour's notice I need to go teach this class, and I'm like, well, this really isn't a lot of prep time. And forgive me if I get the guys wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's Phil Singleton, one of the assaulters from that event. He's like watching me teach my class, and it was utterly surrealistic to get like one of the original SAS bad dudes out there to give me a thumbs up while I'm teaching, especially since I hadn't had a lot of preparation. But definitely an interesting moment in my life.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, it's a fantastic movie, and I love. We need a Maggie Thatcher right now, in my opinion, because here's a woman that normally the SAS would conduct an assault like that at night. She's like, no, I want you to do it in the day, and I want the world to watch. What confidence she must have had in those guys. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Well, and
Yeah.
it's also important to remind people that there are consequences to bad behavior. I realize that's apparently a minority position these days, but it does have a certain value.
No, it does. And having said that, I think that's probably a wonderful segue to get into the meat of today's show. As far as like crime trends and how there's a lack of accountability that's probably leading to some of this really, really egregious behavior. And John, take it wherever you want. What are some of the things you found when you dig down into the data?
So the sad news is I would put all the data together, not just crime, but the overall picture is we are experiencing, I would call it a general societal deterioration. Just societal order is slowly failing. Everybody thinks that there's this one single chaotic moment, but it's a lot of small stuff that accumulates over time that's really killing us. So, for instance, we had a long-term drop in violent crime going from the early 90s, and as the crack wars ended and stuff like that, we had this long-term drop in violent crime. Homicide was down. Things were looking pretty good, and everybody's worried about adverse impacts. What people don't understand is that drop in crime affected minority communities way more than it affected the majority communities. So life was getting better for everybody else. And then around 2014, 2015, with the events that kicked off in Ferguson, with again
Mhm.
that series of lies about hands up, don't shoot. For those that don't know, that was a complete fabrication.
Yep.
Man, violent crime started to reverse itself. We had a pretty good system working. Things were getting better. Our incarceration rates were actually going down because we had less crime going on. So that trend, violent crime goes up a little bit. And then, of course, the George Floyd situation kicks off, and that causes massive societal disorder. I'll just put a plug in for it. A lot, much like we found out that the hands up, don't shoot was a fabricated media lie. I think we're seeing a lot of compelling evidence that the George Floyd situation is not what we thought it was. One of the local TV personalities was married to a Minneapolis union leader. She wrote a book called "They're Lying," and in full disclosure, man, I could not get into the book; it was not compelling. But she also just released a movie. I think it's called Minnesota Burning, and she works much better in that
Is that the
visual
fall
medium.
of Minneapolis? Is
Yeah,
that
also, yeah, that's right. The Fall of Minneapolis, dude. It is
yeah.
an incredible take. If you'll
It's
just
free
empty
on
your cup.
YouTube, guys. It's free. It's a
Yeah, it's
fantastic
absolutely.
documentary.
It's
Yep.
you got to empty your cup and just accept the fact that you may have been lied to. But when those events kicked off, and I don't know how to say it, but the police in America have lost the moral authority to use force to maintain societal order. So we saw this massive spike in violent crime and especially homicides, again, in poor minority communities that was marked around the COVID period. Now, at the same time all this is going on, and excuse me while I put on my tinfoil hat, the FBI was in the process of changing how they collected crime data. So the last year we probably have really, really solid, we can pound on the desk kind of data was 2019.
Mm.
2021 is without a doubt was the worst year for the accuracy of crime dates, and you have to remember we're always talking behind. Typically, the crime data for the previous year is released in October, so we just got the information on 2022.
Mhm.
Excuse me. Um, so 2021 is really, really sketchy. When the FBI changed their reporting system, they were trying to get better data. For instance, we just used to know how many homicides, how many armed robberies. The researchers, I guess, kind of had an admirable goal, and they wanted better information. So they wanted to know if they asked a lot more questions, like, was the suspect, these are examples, left-handed, right-handed, what tattoos did they have, what was their hair straight or wavy? They were seeking a lot more data, and the problem was a lot of agencies simply refused to participate in that. So when I went back and I looked last year, only about 66% of the U.S. population is being covered by agencies that report their data to the FBI. Again, the tinfoil hat stuff, you go to try to get that number I always try to update the presentation. I'm like, how many people are living, what percent of the US population lives in an area where we got really good crime data? And the answer is we don't know. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, some of these other places, they haven't updated that number since over a year ago. So the crime is definitely wonky. We had two major sources of crime, both the FBI, that's crimes reported to police, as well as the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which actually talks to people who have been victimized.
Mhm.
And in this last year, this was this weird split in the two. FBI is claiming that violent crime is down 1.6%, which sounds good, but when you take into factor that a lot of the violent crime being reported is not being reported to the FBI, that's not much faith. And also, the Bureau of Justice Statistics is showing a huge spike in violent crime. I think the numbers I saw was it's up 44% over the last year. Now,
Mm.
full disclosure, the years previous were probably, you probably saw some suppression of violent crime because so much of it's interpersonal with the COVID stuff. So there may be returning to a more um, pre-COVID levels is that with that increase, but it's like on the magic eight ball, the future is uncertain. Where it's really hard to look at these national trends when we combine that our two major sources aren't in complete agreement. The quality of the data has gone down remarkably. And it's a lot harder. It used to be you could just go and download the UCR report for the last
Yeah.
year and see what things were doing. And quite frankly, there's a lot more steps to that with the FBI's crime data explore. I always get amused. One of the things I do every year is I calculate how many homicides the FBI missed.
Mm.
And it's always a disturbing number that they miss because we do have, some alternative sources for homicide data. Um, and the FBI, the official statistics versus, the FBI will tell you how many homicides they are, but when you go and look at their official stats engine, it's not the same number. So
Right.
there's this yawning difference there. And if they're missing, the big point for everybody is if they're missing homicides, right, where you generally have a body that you can count. If they're missing homicides, they're probably missing a lot of other crimes as well. The other thing I throw out there just real quickly, as this general societal deterioration is everybody agrees that property crime is up. It
Mhm.
definitely is. There's all kinds of reasons for that, but you have to remember is that property crime has an absolutely abysmal clearance rate. If you
Yeah.
don't keep your stuff from getting stolen in the first place, you're not going to get it back. The crimes, okay, aren't cleared at a very high rate, and most people, like, if somebody steals your TV, how many people know the serial numbers of their TV? So, the property crime is doubly damning because it's not going to get cleared and you're not going to get your stuff back. So sorry to go off on the big dump there, but that's kind of the quick picture as far as what's been going on over the last little bit.
No, and I didn't want to interrupt you, so I'm scribbling furiously because you gave me so many nuggets. But before I go into some of the follow-on questions I had, I want to welcome some folks on. Guile is on from the Philippines. Ted Littard is on. He is coin number 1461 out there in Mississippi, probably near you. Pat Cahill is on from northern Wisconsin. Chuck Renfro says, good morning and have a blessed day from Texas. Will Wood, my dear friend, is on. Dr. T.C. Fuller is on. He says, John, the other problem I've run into in my own research using this data is one of varied definitions. Aggravated assault has differing definitions, for example, between various states, coupled with your data about limited reporting and the numbers getting really hard to pin down. We also have someone is on this morning that says, good morning, men. Blessed to be catching this session. Well, glad to have you, sir. What do you say to Dr. Fuller's point?
I mean, he is a doctor, so he obviously knows stuff. But I think it's absolutely true. It's becoming harder and harder to trust the official sources, and especially as crime is becoming a political issue again. This is a bizarre world we live in. John Schneider is apparently under Secret Service investigation. I saw that in the news this morning because he made a tweet about Biden. So, we apparently have the resources to investigate, was that Bo Duke, for a
Yeah.
mean tweet. But, crime overall is just in a bad situation. So I think he's completely right that it's harder to trust the data. And, the other thing I throw out is that national trends are interesting, but, you almost have to sit there and accept the fact that crime is not evenly distributed. Living in a rural area, you're much more likely to be concerned about property crime because this is the thing: is you have two big dangers. You have dangers from people that kind of classic stranger danger that everybody worries about, and you've got danger. I'm sorry, people you don't know and people you know. You're far more likely in a rural community to be victimized. Your violent crime is probably going to come from somebody you know. As you move into a more urban society, your risks of violent crime go up, and it's more likely to be from a stranger. So you have to keep that in mind. And then even there's some, the Bureau of Justice Statistics used to do some breakdowns. As a general rule, I'm trying to remember. I want to say women have a greater risk of victimization from people they know.
Mhm.
Men do have a greater risk of victimization from people they don't know. Real quick, I had talked about general societal deterioration. Where I am in the career that I'm leaving right now, we do a lot of traffic safety work, and traffic safety has been a huge push for us. Again, showing the general societal disorder. We have since like the 1940s, okay, which is a pretty good piece back, right? Our number of fatalities per 100,000 miles driven has been going down. That has reversed itself as well. The number of pedestrians killed in the United States has increased dramatically over the last couple of years. I trace that back to, quite frankly, um, traffic enforcement is an optional activity for a lot of police departments. When the police are getting a lot of criticism, they're not going to go out and make the traffic stops. They're not going to engage in aggressive policing on the road, and you combine that with this really, really poorly run experiment in hard drug legalization. It's absolutely amazing to me. I work near Tupelo, Mississippi. You wouldn't think we're a hotbed for crime, but dude, I have my guys are arresting people for DUI drugs almost every day. The
Mm.
chances that the person next to you out there somewhere is cranked out on meth or stoned on marijuana are huge. And we're not talking, just the nature of marijuana has changed over the years with a massive spike in THC. There are some pretty messed up people driving on the roads next to you. So I don't mean to sound like your mom, but just make sure you got your seatbelts, make sure everybody in the car has their seatbelts on, and just drive with the assumption that everybody else on the road is trying to kill you, and you'll probably be better off.
Yeah,
It's not
100%.
sexy. It's not something that a gun solves the problem of, but depending on what your particular profile is, as far as where you live and stuff like that, getting to and from work, to and from your shopping trips may be some of the greatest exposures that you have to an untimely death or a grievous bodily injury.
Well, it is without question. I think statistically speaking, the two most dangerous activities you're going to do, a home fire or a car accident. It's not necessarily a gun solution. Okay, now I got 4 or 5 questions for you, John, based on the opening dissertation you gave us. You mentioned that crime was going down, but was recidivism going down as well?
I would have to go back and check because recidivism is a very, very tough issue to address because you have a small number of criminals who are responsible for the majority of violent crime. I can't pull
Hmm.
the numbers out of my head, but one of the Rand studies I think going back talked about for every felony they admitted that they were incarcerated for, they had probably committed 14.
Yeah.
So you've got that small recalcitrant hardcore criminal population that's really hard to do much with, except the only thing you can do with them is lock them away from the decent people.
Hmm.
What I think you're seeing is your recidivism is going to increase in those marginal cases. People stealing, especially property crime for drugs, to fuel the habits and along those lines. That's one of the big lies we're being told is that the urban wastelands we're seeing, this is all a homeless problem, and it's like no, maybe 25% of that is a homelessness issue. The real problem with a lot of what you're seeing in Portland and Oregon and California to a certain extent is these are open air drug camps because meth, fentanyl, high levels of THC, marijuana, stuff like that is readily available. So you have this population who can kind of exist at this subsistence level and just barely, score enough money to buy the next round of drugs. And that's typically going to come from, if you look at San Francisco, breaking into vehicles. I mean, robbing TV crews while they're broadcasting.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I want to say that the West Coast is giving us a real big preview of what the future looks like is if we don't reverse some of these trends.
Yeah, I agree. A real good friend of mine, we were in the Marines together, and he works for Las Vegas. I won't say anything more than that. And he's on some sort of street suppression unit. He's like, bro, I start at the start of one strip, the strip, and I just arrest homeless people all day long. And the next day I get up and that's my job. Go right back to that spot and just start working my way down. And that's all we do all day long. And then he talked about the people that live under Vegas and has sent me some photographs of that. And it's horrifying, man. It's like Escape from John Carpenter's Escape from New York stuff. It is just absolutely unfathomable. If you had told you and I, John, when we were kids back in the 80s that this was going to go on, I don't know that I would believe it.
It's interesting because, my dear departed friend William April talked about the errors that you make by applying your morality to others, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, people have always said, no, if you legalized hard drugs, people would still be productive citizens. It's because this stuff is illegal that it's causing all these problems. There are not people who would live under in the example of Las Vegas, it's a pretty, you can find YouTube videos on it. These drainage systems that they've built that are almost never used. There are
Mm-hmm.
not people who would live um, in less than third world conditions. Let's be honest, less than third world conditions, just to be able to consume drugs.
Yeah.
And we found that not to be the case. And quite frankly, to a certain degree, the moderate libertarian part of me is like, well, let them do that, except that we're finding that the consequences of letting them do that is pretty dramatic for everybody else.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, if these people weren't taking tax dollars, if they weren't reproducing, if they weren't driving, I wouldn't care that much. But the simple
Mm-hmm.
fact of the matter is that we're subsidizing that lifestyle, right? The most tragic victims of this stuff are the kids, dude. It's
Yeah.
on the business page, I try to share relevant news stories, and the number of kids, when I say kids, I'm talking like 4 years old, you know, 4-year-old kids dying of fentanyl overdoses because their parents are both addicts. The kids are out there are the ones that are really paying for this poorly conducted experiment in hard drug legalization. And I think we pretty much, gotten rid of the theory that people would not live like animals just to take drugs. We've got a lot of evidence to the contrary when it comes to that.
Well, and to my friend's point, of course, this is anecdotal, and you can do with anecdotal evidence whatever you like, but this is a guy that this is what he does every single day, and so much of what he says is that they don't want to live the life that you and I and our families live. That's is the life that they chose. Now you could say, well, they're drug addled, and that's why they're saying that. But in the amount of them that are young people that are choosing this lifestyle is just unfathomable. But I want to pause on that for just a second because I think I want to come back to the general societal deterioration that you talked about. But you said something, you bypassed it. And I really want you to unpack this, John. You said, and I'm going to try to quote you here, the law enforcement community has lost its moral authority to police, or words to that effect. Can you please unpack that, or did I mishear you?
Well, I think I said it several times. The law enforcement has lost the moral authority to use violence to enforce social order, right? And that's the whole problem that we're having, is that we put officers in this catch-22 position where we will still be kind of okay with them going out and doing some proactive policing. But the problem is, if anything goes wrong in that proactive policing, we don't blame the guy that decided to resist arrest. We somehow blame the officers themselves, right? One of the great myths out there is that there are these magic words called de-escalation that the police have always known and simply refuse because they're these evil racist tools of our horrible capitalist society, and that we enjoy causing violence and death and mayhem and harm to innocents. One of the great big myths, I mean, de-escalation is not something you do. In my mind, de-escalation is the result of an agreement between two adults. That, hey,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to take you to jail today. You're gonna have to take the ride. I need you to turn around. Okay, I'm not going. Okay, well, maybe give the guy a few minutes to talk about that kind of stuff. But at a certain point, if he needs to go to jail, he needs to go to jail.
Mhm.
You and I were probably in the law enforcement community raised under the ask, tell, make model, which is that you
100%.
asked a suspect to do something, you told them that they were going to do it, and they didn't do it, you
I'll
made
make
them
them
do that.
100%.
Dude, ask, tell, make is just an artifact of a bygone era of societal policing as far as that stuff goes. I think the algorithm is plead, 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 and just walk away and give up at this point. So,
But then we get a nation of no disrespect to the Dinkeller family. We got a nation of Kyle Dinkellers. You know what I'm saying? And that's what scares me when you plead, 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 plead. When really, in that instance, there was an application of deadly force that was the only thing that was going to solve that problem. And to your point about it requires a level of reasonableness, and assuming value in each other for de-escalation to work. And that there's no assumption of value. There's no ability to have a reasonable, rational conversation. De-escalation will never work. And I'm a firm believer in the what human communication can accomplish. It can accomplish a lot, but it requires that level of reasonableness, John. And we're just not seeing it.
I think absolutely. The real issue is that, again, this is, we're seeing, I think what's happening in the policing world is just signs of a larger societal trends, right? So you have to remember, I've heard it called the common oppression narrative, which makes a great acronym as far as that stuff goes, is we have been telling people that we live in an inherently unfair society based on race for a long time. So when you ask yourself, why are these kids perfectly willing to live under these horrible conditions and not pursue an education or employment or families and stuff like that? It's because we've been telling them through the schools, whether it's high schools, middle schools, college, all the curriculum is based on this, the diversity, inclusion, equity narrative, right?
Mhm.
And it's basically telling these people that if you go out and you succeed, that you're somehow doing that at the expense of
Mhm.
others.
You're just an
The
oppressor
assumption
by
there,
another name. A successful
yeah.
person is just an oppressor. Yeah.
And the whole problem with that is it completely destroys, the future productivity of society. You can only, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher earlier. She had a great quote that, the problem with socialism is you eventually run out of other people's money. And that's what we're running into, is that as the number of productive people in our society decrease, the burden placed on them to support, I like the word miscreants, right? It's
Mhm.
pretty generic. Um, the number of people that are supporting the miscreants just gets smaller and smaller, and the number of people who aren't participating get larger and larger. And when you combine that, the whole narrative coming out of whether it was George Floyd or uh,
Mike
you know
Brown, Trayvon
Mike Brown,
Martin.
and you have the, for lack of better words, you've got governmental organizations feeding that narrative. One of the things that came out was when they looked at the Mike Brown situation, right? They said that his decision to shoot him was completely justified. The suspect's DNA was found on the officer's gun because he was trying to take it away. Well, they go back and look at retrospectively at the Ferguson Police Department. And one of the things that everybody forgets, and I want to say, I'm drawing a blank on where I read this. I want to say it's a female criminologist that has done absolutely great work. She wrote The War on Cops, Heather McDonald.
Hmm.
One of the things that she pointed out is that, when the Department of Justice found disparate policing, the disparities in the policing were at the request of the population. Apparently, one of the most common things the Ferguson Police Department did was write tickets for loud music because the neighbors hated it. It disturbed the common peace and tranquility of the neighborhood.
Mhm.
So, you know, when you have a city that has, has a greater than, average number of minorities, and you start enforcing the laws, there's going to be a disparate impact. It's just the nature of the beast as far as that goes. And to sit there and go that, the Ferguson Police Department was fundamentally racist when a lot of what they were doing was engaging in those kind of societal order crimes at the request of the decent people, it creates a no-win situation for the police. When you combine that, on the police side with the fear of inappropriate indictments, man, the I always call it the incentive disincentive balance. There aren't many incentives for proactive police work these days, but there are a
Absolutely
ton
not.
of disincentives.
100%. Let's get to some comments here if we can. Donald Green is on from occupied Virginia. Dr. TC Fuller says it is also a huge problem that all these prosecutors who just refuse to prosecute crimes. No consequences for the crooks, no incentive for the cops to make the effort and take the risk involved in making arrests. And hey, your crime stats drop. Everyone wins. What do you say to that?
Dude, I just recently got a taste of how bad this stuff has gotten. I supervise small crew of law enforcement guys. What we do is not the typical park service stuff. We work a road. I had two of my officers. They go to arrest let's call it what is a black female. Um, she is DUI on both drugs and marijuana. Um, they put her in the back of the car, arrest her. They've been polite and professional the whole time. They begin to transport her to jail. She slips the cuff, as females with small wrists are known to do, and they have to pull over and get her secured. They spend the next minute calmly issuing verbal commands, calmly using nothing but, basically arm manipulation techniques, forcing her back into the handcuffs. As my buddy said, if he wanted her in handcuffs in 5 seconds, he could have punched her in the face and done it, right?
Yep.
But they basically wrestled her back into handcuffs. In that process, she kneed one of my guys twice in the crotch, and once she was in handcuffs, right, spit in the face of my other officers. In my mind, that's three separate counts of assault on a federal law enforcement officer.
Mhm.
Our U.S. Attorney's Office has completely refused to prosecute that case, and what they offered as their reason for doing that was the optics of putting that set of facts before a jury. That you had basically a black female being wrestled in the handcuff by two white officers. They weren't willing to put that before a jury. So the whole problem with the police is they can go out and arrest people, and they can take on the risks inherent with that. But if they know there's absolutely no repercussions for those people. And this is not, what that's just an instance. I'm just more familiar with that one. But
Mhm.
there's been strong pressures to just get resisting arrest as a non-crime in New York City. And
Mhm.
when you create, when you change that incentive and disincentive system, you're going to get what we've been getting recently.
No, I 100%, which is going to come back to the discussion I'd love to have with you about the general societal deterioration or breakdown, what have you. But we also got Brian Schiller on from North Texas. Uh, Doug is on. He says he is so right. De-escalation only works if all parties involved are trying to make it work. For some, they will not allow de-escalation to work, and then actions must be taken. Of course, Doug is a lieutenant with a agency in Ohio. Says late to the party. Merry Christmas from Columbus, and he's coin number 78. Dr. Fuller says, to John's point, the first time I went to arrest an armed bank robber in 1998, two of us went with a single uniformed officer. When we told the boss that we were headed out to do, all he said was, be careful. If he resists, kill him. And off we went. Yeah, that does not happen anymore. Um, Yeah, I want to get some more comments here because I think there's some good stuff. Donald Green says, used to be some joint respect between Leos and criminals. In many areas, I arrested many for serious stuff with full cooperation. Had to fight a few, of course, but I think that ratio has flipped in current times. And of course, it does when you have an entitled group of Americans that realize they can do whatever they want. There will be no accountability for those actions. Will says, de-escalation reminds me of Golda Meir's you can't negotiate with someone who has come to kill you. At some point, de-escalation requires the criminal's agreement. What say you to that one?
Well, I think it goes back to the point that a lot of this stuff is being offered by people who have, I would say, no practical understanding, or they just don't care. They're more worried about the looking good in the societal aspects. You've had organizations come out and suggest major reforms in policing. And quite frankly, I think was it PERF, the Police Executive Reform Forum or something like that. These are very high level people. And the way you tend to get high level in large police departments is you get out of the field as quickly as possible. So
Mhm.
some of the guys that are making a lot of these recommendations and stuff like that, they ran screaming from the field as soon as they could to be able to move up the organizational structure. So, that's a big problem as far as what's going on.
Dr. Fuller says, I wonder what the narrative will be in 50 years when our policing is done by illegal aliens. And I would laugh at this, but as you may probably know, LAPD just, I think, graduated their first set of recruits that are illegal aliens. You see that, John?
I did. And I know that Illinois has at least similar. I don't think they've done it yet, but they've got similar legislation to allow that to happen. And I would call this, I hate to sound so down, but it's like the third worldization of this country, where the future is going to be is you're going to have rich, wealthy people that live in gated communities that can afford private security, and the generic policing is going to be farmed out to the kind of the lowest common denominator. Whoever we can get them, willing to do a very difficult job for the lowest amount of money.
I had Neil Taylor on the show. He's a corporate attorney in Johannesburg, South Africa. We have several members of AWS that are in South Africa, and I've had him on a couple times, and he's like, apartheid. Those, and he's a white South African. Not that it matters, but it may ring true here in just a moment. Some of the things that he said, and he says, Rich, apartheid did some bad things. So when Nelson Mandela come to power and the Rainbow Coalition came in, they tried to dismantle some of the structures. And one of the things that they saw as a symbol of oppression was the South African police. So they dismantled a lot of it, changed a lot of the laws. He goes, well, really, it only disenfranchised the poor Black South Africans. He goes, I live in a gated community. I have ex-South African special operations forces that ride around in Bearcats all day long to make sure that the people that can afford their services get their services. He says, but everybody outside the gated walls of the community I live in are left to fend for themselves. And I don't understand how folks don't understand that.
Well, that's the great tragedy of a lot of what's been going on is when we talk about these changes and increases in violent crime. I've already mentioned this, but it affects the minority communities the most. You know, the decisions they're making are impacting the people they claim to be helping. And at a certain point, I think it was Thomas Sowell that said at a certain point, you have to stop judging policies by their intent and judge them by their actions or their results. And
Yes.
this is just it is not bearing the fruit they promised us it would. It's I think you can say things are demonstrably better, or I'm sorry, things are demonstrably worse than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, as we're starting to, push this stuff out. My friend Eric Gelhaus likes to point out that, you have departments, one of your keys are your field training officers.
Mm-hmm.
If they stop policing in 2014, we're getting ready to turn 2024 is right around the corner. It is entirely possible that that body of competent trainers is no longer in that position to do training. So not only are we not doing proactive policing, but that reservoir of institutional knowledge that allowed us to do that is also decaying as well. So it's not like we can just flip a switch and throw everything back because number one, we don't have necessarily the same level of institutional knowledge, and we don't
Mm-hmm.
have the support for it. It is a simple fact. It's very hard to get people prosecuted for doing bad stuff, especially when that's directed to the police officers. So you're again changing the incentive and disincentive structures for the police to go out and do what has been their job. I'm 53 years old. That was, up until fairly recently, that was the job of the police, was to put
Mm-hmm.
bad people in jail.
Yeah, and then what is the loss of qualified immunity doing on top of all this? Now, not that law enforcement has lost qualified immunity everywhere, but it seems to be a trend, doesn't it?
It certainly does. I think that's the kind of stuff that again makes people hesitate. I haven't seen hard numbers. I know Colorado completely got rid of qualified immunity as far as that goes. But again, it's changing that incentive and disincentive structure. Qualified immunity gets a bad rap because most people don't understand how it actually works. The whole idea behind qualified immunity was that if the courts are going to change the rules for policing, we're not going to hold the officers accountable to the prior standards. The greatest example of that was Tennessee versus Gardner, when the Supreme Court ruled that you can no longer use deadly force generically on fleeing felons. There are some circumstances in which you can use deadly force on a fleeing, currently dangerous felon, but okay, we're changing the rules. So from this point forward, you can't do that. Well, the whole issue is what about the people who had used deadly force prior to that? And qualified immunity was basically set up as a positive incentive system to allow necessary changes to be made. Now, the problem is a lot of people doing bad work will hide behind qualified immunity, right? But again, it's the classic cultural war thing that's going on is you have a situation in which let's say 1 to 3% of people are using something inappropriately, and it's used the vast majority of the time appropriately. What gets all the public attention? That 1 to 3%, because what they're looking to do is they know if they can go after that 1 to 3% and highlight it, then they can destroy it for the other 97%. This stuff is not coincidental, let's say.
Yeah. No, it's not. And Dr. Fuller says Colorado got rid of qualified immunity for cops, but not for prosecutors. Weird. And that's the thing, if I was still a Leo and that was the case, and Tennessee said, okay, yeah, this is what we're going to do. But prosecutors on down. Everybody's losing it. I'm like, oh, okay.
Oh
You know,
no,
but
it's worse than that. You have to
mhm,
remember is that the police officers get qualified immunity. Most judicial officials have absolute immunity,
that is
which is
correct.
a much higher standard. The judge making his rulings, the prosecutors making their decisions, they are protected by absolute immunity. There is no recourse against those decisions. And I don't hear any of those people, demanding that their protections be removed as well.
No. Let's go to Doug's comment. He says, as law enforcement officers, we cannot give up the fight when it comes to fair and equitable policing for all. I'm concerned about the privatization of policing to the point where only those, only those that can afford it will receive it. I know that has happened in other parts of the world, but it cannot happen here. The poorest and most vulnerable will be the most victimized in that kind of system, without question. And we've seen it time and time again around the world, and it's coming to a city near you, I'm afraid. Doug also goes on to say the biggest misconception is that qualified immunity is that it only applies to police. As Dr. Fuller was stating, qualified immunity applies to all government. Yeah. Bruce Hoisington is in the house. Coin number 481. Good morning, Bruce. You mentioned something. Let's go back to the thing I wanted to talk about before we get into the cognitive pistol training that you're doing. General societal deterioration. Please break that down. How did it happen? And more to the point, where is it going?
So I think it ties into stuff we were just talking about was the impact on these minority communities. Again, the again, if you go back and look at this historically, the classic KGB communists wanted to destroy this country, and they knew it wasn't going to happen in a day or a decade. There has been I would say, a long-term process, probably going back to if you look at it, the 20s or the 30s, with the original, kind of, taking control of the education system to begin with, right? They are trying to destroy, for lack of better words, um, modern capitalist society. I always have this neat list in my head, and I was always drawing a blank, but there are certain common values that we as a country have generally shared. Um, Individual responsibility, something that nobody wants to talk about, and it's funny because he mentioned Dave Ramsey, is this whole idea of thrift, right? We actually earn money. If we need extra money, you know what we do? We work extra hours, right? Somebody getting paid more because they're working more overtime is not inherently unfair, right? We save up for what we need in order to put our families in a much better financial situation down the road. Again, uh, self responsibility. If I screw up, it's my fault, not society as a whole. And I would say we could probably sit down, take a few minutes, and identify a core set of values that had been traditionally associated with us. Like I said, us growing up probably about the same time, probably rural community and stuff like that. There has been a deliberate attack on those values. It's kind of like, turning a ship. It's going to turn very, very slowly. But I think what we're starting to see is that, when they took over the education system, well, that just turned the ship a degree or two. But the problem is, if you turn the ship a degree or two, you give it enough time, you've radically changed the course. And I think what's
Mhm.
happened is we've kind of reached this, the whole rise of woke, for lack of a better example, was an attempt to really, really crank that wheel harder to the left. Before they had been looking to put 1 or 2 degrees on the course. Now they're looking to put, 10 or 20 degrees on the course. The fact that it's completely disconnected from reality does not bother these people as far as any of this stuff goes. They're they don't realize they're arguing for this. What they're basically arguing for is, for lack of a better word, a glorious revolution in which we overturn everything we've had, and they're going to replace it with some utopian ideal. And yeah, I would say utopian idealism is probably the biggest threat we have as a country. Is like, if we just look at this diversity, inclusion, and equity stuff, if we just implement all this stuff, things are going to be better. Well, in order to correctly give the correct medicine to a patient, you have to know what the problem is. If you have misidentified what the problem is and you push the wrong medicine, you're going to make things worse. And I think that the long-term goal, not everybody's involved in this stuff, obviously, but when they're not realizing the second and third tier consequences of what they're advocating for. A lot of people can see the first order consequences of what they're doing, but nobody seems to stop and think about, what's the second, what's the third tier consequences long term of these decisions, especially when they're carried out, over a number of, not just necessarily years, but decades as well.
No, I 100% agree with you, and it reminds me of something I saw General Mattis say. It's like, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I spend the first 55 minutes defining the problem. Let's make sure we have, you know, a complete understanding, or we call it kukumu, complete uh, mutual understanding of what the problem is, and then setting about solving the problem is relatively straightforward at that point. But if you don't identify what the problem is, you can misidentify the problem, like you said, and push the wrong medication. I love that. And to your point, you and I probably grew up in a rural southern community, perhaps. I know I did. And I think the divide, the culture war, because that's another term you used. Of course, we hear it banted about all over the media, but is really the division isn't necessarily black or white. You could say rich or poor, but really it comes down to rural and urban, and the way that the urban pockets of America are going and the way the rural community is going. I mean, when I don't see the problems here on the Cumberland Plateau that I see on the news. It's a very insular, southern rural community, lots of farming, cows. I mean, we just don't have the problem. But then I go into Philly. Mike and I taught a class up there, and it's like, it's a freaking wasteland, brother. What in the hell is going on?
Well, and that, when you start packing people in, it creates different problems. I apologize for this rant, but I was actually one of my majors in undergrad was political science, and we had to read some of the original founders. There was a big fight at the founding of the country about what kind of country we wanted it to be. You had the Jeffersonians arguing for a much more of an agrarian, dispersed population versus the people arguing, originally, central banks, that kind of stuff. On the other side of that stuff. So this has been a cultural debate for a long, long time. And that tipping point between rural and urban um, was key. Now, the tipping point where the population was more urban took place a long time ago. But what happened was we're finally getting people who have been raised solely in that, I think, urban environment. For
Mhm.
a long time, that there was a lot of flight from the rural communities to the cities. Those people brought with them rural values, but now those people and their descendants have been entirely raised in that urban community, denser populations, more specialized as far as that kind of stuff goes. So we're really starting to bear those fruits.
Well, I mean, and again, this is nothing new. I mean, like you said, go back to read the Federalist Papers, or go back and look at de Tocqueville, right? I mean, he talked about one side of the Ohio River is one way, and the other side, the southern side of the Ohio River, is completely different. So these kind of things. But I think your point is it's finally bearing fruit. Add on to that mainstream media and some of the other things, and I think you get to the societal deterioration. Talk to me about the culture war. And I know that we're maybe stepping far afield of a self-defense, self-preservation podcast, but I want to get your, let's define what that term means. Let's talk about what is the problem with that, if there is a problem, and what a potential solution might look like, John.
So there are people that are a lot smarter on the culture war stuff than I am, and I just simply defer to them for a lot of that stuff. Um, there's certain people I would highly recommend, because I don't listen to much music anymore. I watch YouTube videos because we're kind of in a golden age of information. For instance, there is a economist. He happens to be black, so that he's allowed to say things that other people aren't, by the name of Glenn Lowry. And he has regular discussions with like-minded people and people that don't agree with him about what this larger cultural war is going on. I would say, speaking in a very, very general sense, since I'm unprepared for this, thank you, Rich. The culture war is again about values. Are we going to live in a more capitalist society that is based on individualism, or is it a move toward collectivism? I think that would probably be a fairly good take on that. Is it individualism versus collectivism? And a lot of the values we're describing are reflective of somebody from an individualistic mindset versus this collective mindset where everything is about groups. That's one of the great disservices about what's going on is for years we judged people by who they were, right? Not by who their group was. The problem is when you start judging people by groups, what you are essentially doing is creating factions, right?
Mhm.
One of the scariest long-term possible consequences. This is not advocacy in any way, shape, or form. I'm not advocating for this at all, right? But if you continually tell white people that they're evil and the cause of the problem, you know, it's eventually going to cause people to start to band together on the basis of groups. One of the best things this country ever did was said, we are going to judge people as individuals. I don't care what your background is. I don't care. what parts you came with from the factory. We're going to judge you by your deeds, not by your words. We're going to judge you by your deeds as an individual. As you make that collectivist shift, dude, that's a scary road to go down. I mean, the Soviets already did that. If you don't know, I'm drawing a blank on what the technical term is, but basically
Identity
the
politics. Are
mass
you talking
murder
about
of the
that?
Ukrainians by starvation, dude. We've been down that road before.
Mhm.
It's not like it's uncharted territory. We know where this stuff goes, and it is not pretty as
Well,
far as that
human
stuff
beings are
goes.
societal. My degree is in social psychology. So human beings, of course, are social animals, and we're very tribal. So you get this DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion stuff going. You get identity politics fully embraced by one side of the aisle, and then you have exactly what you said: a splintering, a polarization of America. Not, as to use Pat Cahill's term, "one nation under God." E pluribus unum, from many one. You get from many many, which is a problem. And to your point about the Glenn Lowry show, if you're not watching Glenn Lowry on YouTube, you really should be. He's a brilliant man. I believe he might be a professor at Brown, or he's an Ivy
He's a
League
professor,
professor.
economist professor at Brown. That's the
Yeah.
just. I'm sorry to interrupt here. The only people I trust anymore are the economists. Social
Yep.
sciences have been so corrupted. The replication crisis has shown us that these people can't be trusted. Dude, the
Hmm.
economists are the only ones that are, number one, smart enough to be able to do the math, right? Because there's a lot of deadwood in social science programs and universities. The economists are the last ones that I've trusted. I thought it would take them about 5 years, but the economists have really shown what a disaster, for instance, the whole COVID response was. So I trust the economists are about the last academics I trust anymore.
I'm gonna throw up this Glenn Lowry show in the comments section. So the show that I've just posted there is Glenn Lowry and another African American professor from an Ivy League university, and they have just watched The Fall of Minneapolis, which John and I were discussing at the
The one,
beginning of the
yeah.
show. And they have watched it, and they're like, "Oh my God, this is the." I think the title of the show is "This is the lie that destroyed America," and I'm like, "That's a pretty profound statement." But it's not just the lie, it just is another layer to the story. And again, go all the way back to when you came on board as a police officer. We had just had, oh God, all the names are mixing in my head at this
Rodney
point.
King. I came on in '92, so Rodney King would have
Rodney
just
King,
been kicked
exactly.
off. Yeah.
So Rodney King had just happened, and I know that I can't tell you how many times I go to arrest an African American, and the background would be screaming Rodney King, and it's like we're nobody's fighting here. It's just one guy going in a set of handcuffs for breaking the law, and everybody's chill, but the community is screaming Rodney King at the top of their lungs, trying to get something going. It's like, man. And now layer onto that, hands up, don't shoot, and all these other lies that are propagated. And I really, and at the end of that Glenn Lowry show, I hope you've probably seen that one, John.
Well, I have. It's powerful stuff,
It's powerful. And at
especially
the
if you
very
know.
end, the two professors conclude that Obama, a lot of this lies at the foot of Obama and Eric Holder. And I'm like, man, they're so spot on.
Absolutely, that's a very, very powerful show, especially if because Glenn Lowry tends to be more what we think of as conservative. John McWhorter is definitely more liberal. So when you have somebody like John McWhorter going, "Holy crap!" This unless because it's funny because McWhorter is struggling to embrace what he saw because one of the things they did was they hid the actual body cams from us, right? Like he was complaining about not being able to breathe before they ever put him in a patrol car, right? So John McWhorter is like, unless this is artificial intelligence that has generated false video, I don't know. He's completely stunned. It's like this is a man whose worldview has been fundamentally changed as far
Right.
as accepting reality.
And the lethal dose for fentanyl for someone the size of Mr. Floyd is, I think, 4 nanograms, and Mr. Floyd's toxicology report showed that he had 11 nanograms, so almost a 3 times lethal dose of fentanyl. He was a dead man. I mean, there was no question about it. He had probably ingested the own drugs, ingested those drugs just prior to the arrest, because he had done that previously in other arrests. He had eaten the dope so he wouldn't take the charge. And we see this, you and I saw this in the 90s. This is nothing new. Criminals will eat that dope. Nowadays, though, with fentanyl, you're killing yourself. You're committing suicide.
Realistically, here's the ugly truth: was in the '90s, that if they had seen him grabbing the dope, they would have done something that's completely unacceptable on body cam, which was they would have grabbed him by the throat and prevented him from swallowing it, right?
Mhm.
But you can't. We're not allowed. don't even get me started on the loss of the lateral vascular neck restraint for policing and stuff like that. We can't do that anymore. So the police were completely incapable of him effectively committing that act of suicide that he did.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
the
tell you
joys
that
of contemporary policing.
the LVNR, lateral vascular neck restraint, whatever you want to call it, rear naked choke. I mean, I was 4 years as a bouncer. I've choked out innumerable numbers of people safely as a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner for the last 7 or 8 years. We teach this in children's classes. Little 5-year-old girls are putting an LVNR on someone, and it's no big deal. And why you taking the magic technique, if there is one, away from law enforcement and place it at where the Glock 22 comes in is this insanity to me. I don't get it.
Well, it is. And this is the whole problem. So what we're talking about for this one is like basically a rear naked choke. And this is
Yeah.
the whole problem. Police do not possess tranquilizer guns, right?
Nope.
You are dealing with people who have generally ingested a large amount of illegal substances that want to fight. They don't issue us tranquilizer guns. They don't exist. You can never, you don't know, even if they did, you wouldn't know the dose of the medicine to give you, right? So there are no magic words to make them comply. We don't have any tranquilizer guns. The closest thing we had to being able to safely arrest somebody that's under that degree of influence was the rear, that LVRN,
Mhm.
let them pass out, put them in handcuffs, and when they wake up, they're a lot cooler. Chuck Haggard, his department, he was an instructor in LVRN.
Mhm.
His department had a bunch of those in the field. Didn't have any deaths. If you think about it, if LVRN is as dangerous as it is, the police should be lined up outside of BJJ academies waiting to arrest everybody in there for attempted murder.
Exactly.
I think it's part of that, crazy thing of taking away effective tools from the policing. If I cannot effectively control a dangerous, violent person, I'll just simply drive slower to get to that call so that he's gone by the time I get there. It's policing by long commute time at this point.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting one. I know my department tracked all that data. I would love to see the data on that nationwide. It's like that's a really good point. Bill says the push for diversity is one of the worst things to happen to us. You cannot keep a nation without a national identity and a single culture. That culture can be a melting pot, but it has to be a melting pot and not a bunch of separate cultures. Yeah, and it just doesn't work. Dr. Fuller says everyone who has been put out in training by a rear naked choke, raise your hand. And Doug says, yeah, multiple times. But it works, and if used safely and correctly, I'm not going to say it has a zero probability for disaster. There have been people that have been, but it's normally not the technique. It's a misunderstanding of the technique. It's a misapplication of the technique. Of course, we saw Eric Garner. Eric Garner was a heart attack waiting to happen. And it's like, well, he's selling loosies on the street. Is this really a reason to die? And also, if you look at the officer, he does not use an LVNR. He uses some sort of bar arm choke where it's compression on the airway. But even still, I believe the autopsy on Eric Garner showed that there was no damage to the trachea. Do you know about that one?
My understanding is that the autopsy did not show that as others. I think the sad reality is by you bringing up things like autopsies is almost like objective facts matter anymore. You have to remember, with the Minneapolis case, the actual coroner conducted the autopsy, could not find any signs of damage to the airway structures. They then had two expert autopsy people come in and blame the choke without ever having examined the body. Um, so the whole Eric Gardner situation was a dude that had a heart attack resisting the police.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things those are long series of decisions, and the whole problem is that the selling the loosies is a public disorder, offense. My understanding was that was not a standalone event. He had many counters with New York Police Department, and I think that day he decided he wasn't going to fight as far as that stuff goes. That was not the fault of the officer. It's just that simple.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Doug says one of the things that absolutely boggles my mind is that why are we not locking down the border? The fentanyl that is coming across the border by the kilo is massive and is killing more than 75 people per year. Those are epidemic level numbers that could easily be 4 to 5x that number, if not for Narcan. And he is spot on. And before I turn that question over to you, John, this is another thing. Statistically, we lose 8 on average, 8 educators and children in school shootings. And of course, to stop those 8 deaths, or we have one side of the aisle that's willing to just erase the Second Amendment, and yet look at these levels of drug overdose deaths. I mean, we're in excess of 1 million thus far. But like I said, on average, annually, we're losing this number, and yet nobody's willing to do anything about it. What say you?
I think that's absolutely the case. The fentanyl crisis again and again. I don't mean to put on the tin hat, but the question we have to ask ourselves is that classic question: was I can never pronounce it correctly, of que bene or que bono? Who benefits, right? Well, dude, I think you can make a strong argument that this is part of a long term. All this stuff benefits the Chinese as far as this stuff goes. I think there's fairly compelling evidence that all this fentanyl is coming directly from China. I think they're shipping the precursors from China to Mexico. Mexico mixes it up and pushes it into the country. So it's a deliberate attempt to destroy the productivity of the country. I'm going to bunny trail here for a second. Everybody talks about prohibition as if it was a massive failure, right? And prohibition did not completely get rid of alcohol consumption in this country, but it fundamentally changed the nature of alcohol consumption in this country. Before prohibition, people got up and had a shot of whiskey and pretty much stayed drunk for most of the days. A lot of your workmen and stuff like that basically stayed drunk the entire time. By making prohibition made the cost of that prohibitive, and it fundamentally changed the nature of alcohol consumption in the country for the better and the worse. All right. Good news is less daily intoxication. Bad news, more binge drinking, right? I would offer this. If prohibition had not happened, the United States industrial capacity would not have been there to help us win World War II, because I get that storming the beaches of Normandy was huge, but when World War II was dudes in factories cranking out, a B-24 bomber every hour, right? So again, we're not looking at the second and third order consequences of the decisions that we're making.
Well, in the second, third order consequences, it's interesting to say that because they're multivariable problems. And anytime you have a multivariable problem, trying to disentangle it is always incredibly difficult. And, prohibition also brought in a level of gang violence that we had never seen before. We're talking about in the green room before we went live, I'm heading back to Scotland. And, when they talk about prohibition in America and Scotland, I mean, they just hang their head because it just destroyed their distillery business and brought in a lot of organized crime as well and an international trade. But we talked about crime, and I want to just kind of start there, John, in order to say, I think based on that kernel, you've created the cognitive pistol class, and a lot of the things that you're doing with that, you and Tom and Lee and some other folks, thinking with a firearm in your hand. Can you talk to us about the genesis of that and where that is going and what's it about?
So, how do I say this? I think that a lot of people that are interested in the self-defense side more of the house, and let me tell you about this. Before we start talking about stuff, I am not poo-pooing competition. I love shooting matches and stuff like that. I have a couple of trophies and stuff like that, so I'm not poo-pooing competition. But as you take those same competitive skills and start to apply them in the real world, some of our best practices in competition tend to break down in the real world, right? So, part of the genesis of this stuff is, while it's great to take a quarter second off your draw stroke, it's a lot more efficient to start 2 seconds sooner, right? So being able to identify circumstances and make complex decisions, I would say, is a big part of that genesis. The other advantage to the cognitive stuff is everybody thinks they're a good pistol shot, right? If I want to know if you're a good pistol shot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to think while running the gun. Tom had some drills. I've been with Tom over 20 years now, where you were responding to verbal commands. And he came up eventually with the casino drill. And the casino drill is one of those drills that looks deceptively simple. You've got 6 shapes. They have numbers on them. You shoot one once, two times, all the way up to 6. Depending on which version of that you run, the gun is going to run out of ammunition at inconvenient spots, right? The people who can really shoot run casinos really, really quick. It's the people who aren't that sure with their gun, where they're taking a certain part of their mental energy just to run the gun, that really, really suffer under that. So we've known for a long time, not just in the self-defense world, but especially like in the aviation and the space race world, is that as you put tasks, we call it task loadings or cognitive load. as you put cognitive load on people, that their performance decreases. So we have been looking, um, I would say, intentionally and unintentionally on ways to work that. So I'm teaching some classes right now that are kind of a culmination of that, where that's actually the main focus. Don't for those classes, don't come to me asking how to press a trigger straight back. I state very clearly, you need to be able to run the gun. These are the standards that I expect you to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to either impose natural loads on people or artificial loads and make you think with the gun in your hands. So it's not just on the beep, deliver a bill drill.
Yeah.
I will give you the opportunity in the 2-day class to deliver a bill drill, but you'll deliver that bill drill based on visual stimulus that isn't on the target itself, right? Because most of our signals are going to be visual. And I may ask you to stop performing that bill drill. And if you just sat there and burned bill drill in, bill drill, you're going to fire 6 no matter what. When I
Mhm.
ask you to stop shooting, and again, let's be realistic. Everybody thinks of, well, he dropped the gun, I can keep shooting him, I'm good. You have to understand that in the real world, you're probably not going to be alone. You may have an innocent that you pick up out of your peripheral vision as you're engaging that primary threat, and you're going to have to stop the shooting process because rule 4 is being aware of your background and what's behind the target, what's in front of it, is really easy on a square range, but
Mhm.
in the real world it gets very, very complex. So I have remote control lights I use for this. I will use movement around friendlies that don't need to be shot to do this. So the whole idea is that, let's be honest, at a certain point you shoot good enough. Especially, dude, if you're trying to be an IPSC grandmaster, if that brings joy to your heart, by all means, go do that. Okay. I'm not poo-pooing any of that stuff. But as a practical, pragmatic level, most of us have limited resources. What we need to be looking for is our point of diminishing returns. And this isn't
Mhm.
just my opinion. I've been able to talk to some really, really smart people. One of the things that there seems to be a lot of agreement on is that somewhere around USPSA C class to USA, certainly by B class shooter, you've probably reached the point of diminishing returns as far as, performing shooting skills, splits, draw time, stuff like that. There's a lot of other stuff that's more important than just your raw ability to perform those mechanics. So what we need to do is we need to put you in an environment where the better you can shoot, certainly the better off you're going to be. I don't know if you know Randy Harris. He's out of Chattanooga as far as that stuff goes. Runs Harris Combative Strategies, long-term firearms instructor. I mean, we went to the NTI together decades ago now.
Mhm.
He went through that class and he's like, yeah, dude, the fact, and he's, placed very, very well IDPA, like worlds and stuff like that. He goes, yeah, the fact that I could shoot so well allowed me to simply um, not let you screw with me because I will give you conditions where you can only shoot if this and this are present, and I will take one away and turn the other one. Um,
Mhm.
so the whole point of that is to make you think with a gun in your hand. Along those same lines, I will use the concept of tactical anatomy as one of those loads that I put on people.
Mhm.
So we're going to talk about anatomy. We're going to watch people get shot and stabbed, and how long does it take somebody to bleed out realistically? We're going to put that in context. We're going to use anatomically correct targets, and at a certain point, shamelessly stolen from Louis Auerbach, we have to start looking at the 3D problem. There are certain, rounds that I can fire on a 3-dimensional target that if you transpose those on a 2-dimensional target, it's like, dude, you shot way to the left. What's wrong with you? There's something wrong. If I flip that around, I wish I thought to share the pictures with you. Those 2 rounds that are far off to the left on a 3D target may have been exactly where they needed to be. And again, if you're a Southern boy that's been raised deer hunting, this is no dust stuff. People that have
Mhm.
hunted and tried to figure out the perfect angles to put a whitetail down know how to do this stuff instinctively. And it's not that hard to teach people to do. It's more a matter of exposure. It's like, let's look at the problem. Let's start out in a very much a crawl, walk, run fashion, and let's give you some additional skills other than taking another tenth or another 100th off your split. I think we've all been there, dude.
Yeah.
If you can work down like on, let's say, on a strong side draw, especially if you're concealment, you can get down to 1.5 pretty easily. But dude, every tenth you take off after that is a lot of work. And what I found was I've been perilously close to a 1 second draw at times. But what'll happen is as soon as I'm not drive practicing twice a day, I creep back up to 125 pretty quickly. So I think we need to be looking at our points of diminishing return and worrying about other skills other than just running the gun slightly more faster. Again, taking a tenth off your draw stroke is cool. That takes a lot of work. Rather than worry about that tenth of a second, let's just start a second sooner. it'll really change the dynamics of the fight as far as that goes.
Yeah, I love it. We're going to break apart some of the things you just said, but I want to get to Dr. Fuller's comment. He says, I wish you luck in this endeavor, John. I've talked quite a bit about it in my award-winning book, No Safe Alternative. And I believe you have a copy there as well. Um, we were talking about it before you came on the show, Dr. Fuller. It says it's an area that is grossly undertrained and absolutely, look at that, huh?
Yeah.
How's that? Absolutely critical. Press on. Pat Cahill says the goal should always be to increase your reactionary gap. Fundamentally, identifying the threat and taking the appropriate action is the easiest way to increase that reactionary gap. Johnny King says performance anxiety is a whole lot different than absolute fear for your life. And he is 100% correct. Dr. Fuller says safely operating the gun and hitting what you're shooting at is a minimum standard to fighting with a gun in the real world. Like learning to fly a plane happens before you learn to dogfight. The greater your raw skill, the more mental bandwidth. And this is the point I was going to get to. And I'm going to read this again. The greater your raw skill, the more mental bandwidth you have available for everything else that is going on in a deadly force scenario. But you certainly are correct. You reach that point of diminishing return. And to me, that's it. If you free up all that bandwidth, I don't need to worry about the gun. I can load, I can run with a gun in my hand. I can do all these things. Then now my brain can process what's going on. So I think your point, get the shooter to this level, an acceptable level, whatever that may be. Now let's start adding on stuff. And in the adding on that you've talked about, what do you think about what Dusty Solomon's doing over there at Building Shooters with the new Neuro? What do you think about that?
Dude, that stuff's amazing. He and I have corresponded. We've been on a podcast together. I did John Hoshin's class where he uses the neuros. Um, it's a very complimentary stuff. So what I would say is there's probably three of us, and it's funny because we're all named John. You've got John Hearne, you've got John Hoshin, and you've got John Murphy, who are out there saying you need to be worrying about something other, okay, than taking a tenth off or 5/100s at a certain point off your splits as far as that stuff goes.
Mhm,
What's great is we all have different takes on it. I would say our classes are very, very complementary in that we're not going to overlap a lot. You're going to get different aspects of it.
mhm,
A lot of what I do is based on a more general environmental awareness. Like, I don't want to give away all the secrets, but I will make people in a shooting class have a legitimate 360 scan. I mean, we
mm,
talk about it, we do the range kabuki and stuff like that,
mhm,
but I will have people legitimately looking around um, to make decisions to shoot or not to shoot. And number one, they quickly realize that's a bunch of Hollywood BS because solo operators die really fast in the real world as far as that kind of stuff. But it's an important aspect that you're focusing on the stuff in the environment and stuff like that. Hoshin works both shoot the when to start shooting into his, or I guess I would say this. A friend of mine that's done both said I focus more on when to start shooting, and Hoshin's focuses more on when to stop shooting.
mm,
One of the advantages the neuros have over what I do is that the neuros are basically a shot timer with lasers on them.
mhm.
So he can tell you if you fired, you can fire 2 rounds after the laser goes off. If you're a really good shooter, you can fire 2 shots in a half second.
Oh yeah.
Court wise, shots fired a half second after the threat diminishes is certainly defensible. We could probably push that out even further, but it's stopping that shooting process is huge. I go about it a slightly different way. I got to give the guy credit. I was out in Oklahoma. There's this dude you might have heard from, sketchy dude by the name of Bill Armstrong. He has a really nice range out in Oklahoma.
He was
But I
just
had
on
two
this
guys.
morning.
Yeah, he was just there. I got a return fire. That's all that is. Um, but I had two guys. I was really happy to see some cops in the class, and they're both firearms instructors for their agencies. And one of the guys like is just burning it down. We're doing a lot of, I have all these evil variations of casino drills that take less ammo, make you think more. And we finally get to the point where I'm asking them to start and stop. And his whole shooting style changed.
Yeah.
I mean, he went from being that dude that's capable of a 2 second bill drill. And all of a sudden, when he's running his bill drills, he probably pushed his splits out at least 35, at least 40. And that's what I found with Holston's class with the neuro. The advantage of that is you can really learn to dial it in. You know,
Yep.
it's really, really hard to stop shooting the process if your splits are at say 2.5 or below.
Mhm,
Uh, you know, once you're running your splits into 35s, 40s, somewhere like that, maybe with a little bit of training. Hoshin says with training, you can push it down to 30. You can make the decision to stop much easier. And again, the advantage of the neuro is that you can actually quantify those numbers a lot better. What I'll do is I'll, like, for instance, with my stuff for the stopping shooting is you'll be shooting the 3D target, so you're still thinking about the 3D problem, and I'll make you
Mhm.
stand to the side, and then you go in the turning target's face, and you have to stop when the turning targets go away, and you're basically the people that you're working with, your classmates, will tell you whether you successfully stop shooting as far as that stuff goes. I think they're all very, very valuable skills that have, huge value as far as making people do something other than just shoot the pistol a little bit better.
No, I agree with everything you just said. I think I went through did some training with Dusty here in Nashville for I don't know 3 days I think recently, and I'm going to another thing with him in February. And I have a couple of neuros here. If you haven't thought about what John just said, the neuro is basically, and if you're interested, check out Building Shooters, what Dusty Solomon is doing over there. But I mean, I think that for a long time, those of us that were raised on shot timers going back to the late 80s, it's setting you up for the go command or is an audible, but that's not the way it's going to work in reality. It's going to be something visual. I have to see it and process this information. So in that regard, the neuro does a great job. And to your point about creating a 360 effect inside of a shoot house that we're in, so you can shoot on all 360 degrees, and he's got the neuro set up everywhere. So when you're doing your scan, you may have to engage in ways that you just can't do on a flat range. And you can look at the data, download it, spreadsheet it, CSV it, and do all kinds of neat stuff with it. So it's an amazing tool, and I really hope the community embraces it because the feedback that it can give you is incredible.
I think and I think the key point is Holston's shown it, and there's really good outside research that shows this stuff is trainable, right? If you
Mhm.
go and take Holston's 2-day class working with the neuros, you will learn to the speed at which you can comfortably make decisions. Depending on the problem, Holston will integrate movement into his. It may tell you which way to offline as far as that stuff goes. All this stuff is very, very trainable. As an example of that, there's this awesome researcher out there by the name of I think his name's Adam Biggs. He actually had a article published in Nature magazine, probably the most prestigious scientific journal out there, in which the phrase "bill drill" appears. Right, so he understands what we're doing as far as this stuff goes. He had done an experiment. It was basically initially done with college students, and then later done with people in the academy, where they looked at some of these brain training exercises you can do. They basically had shooting instructors identify which of these exercises might help with shooting, which ones not. So they had a control group. They got the exercises that would not help with shooting. They had a treatment group that got the treatment. And over, like, maybe twice a week for a month, they were able to reduce mistake of fact shootings by 18%. So
Wow.
that, if you think about, that's a huge difference for just a little bit of work. I think the whole issue is it's like it's you have to actively train it. Like, for instance, we know we can train our eyes to focus better, to process visual information more quickly, but unless somebody tells you how to do it and makes you do it, you're not going to actually train that area. So the good news is what we're seeing is, whether it's my approach, Holton's approach, Murphy's approach, this stuff is very trainable. And moving back to our earlier discussion, trying to tie this stuff in,
Mhm.
I'm not really super optimistic about the future. What you're going to see is this continued bifurcation of the country. What you are going to have to choose to do is to live in an area of the country where you are going to be allowed to defend yourself.
Mhm.
And even in those areas, the quality of your defense of yourself is under greater and greater scrutiny. And not shooting sometimes, shoot one 3 or 4 or 5 times after the threat has disappeared is going to be a really, really good way to make that self-defense incident look as good as possible and avoid the whole criminal justice system. Because you have to remember is it doesn't matter if you're ultimately found innocent. The process is the punishment.
Yeah.
That is a we talk about, like, like farm equipment. The justice system is like this huge farm thing run off a PTO by a tractor with a bunch of exposed gears and stuff like that. And if you get anywhere near it, you have a dangling sleeve or anything like that, there's always a chance you'll get pulled into it. And man, you don't want to take that ride. If that's why the aversion for the armed citizen is so important. And that's one of the things, with the class that we'll do in the 2-day version, is one of the options, because I'll tell you what to do and I'll tell you when to do it, and you'll have to execute it. One of them is just simply to walk away.
Mhm.
We talk about for the armed citizen, just leaving is a really good option, but we never actually train it. If you
Mhm.
don't actually train it, you're probably not going to do it.
Yeah, Dr. Fuller says, somebody asked him, "What is your self-defense technique?" or something like this. Headlong flight. Yeah, and if you can, you should. I want to get to a couple of comments here. Then I want to ask you a question. Dr. Fuller says, well, I'm going to come back to that one because that's a question you need to answer. Alan Kelly says that's another reason I use force on force with Sims, interacting with de-escalation and shoot no shoot decisions incorporated. Pat Cahill says, how was your training modified based on the age and capabilities of the student?
So to answer that, it really doesn't matter because regardless of your age and your capabilities, we're all held to the same legal standards, the same quality of the decisions. What I would say is this is that for some of this stuff, if I give you um, earlier, like fire a failure drill based on a visual signal, but stop when the signal goes away. You may have to, as an older person, because we do know that reflexes tend to diminish over time. You may just have to focus on pressing the trigger a little more slowly to make sure you
Mhm.
have the ability to interact with what's going on. The other thing I'd point out, you mentioned Sims. The other thing I'd point out is the live fire stuff I'm doing is very much a complement to the 1 day lecture I do called "Who Wins, Who Loses, and Why."
Mhm.
In that class, I tell you a bunch of stuff you need to be doing and training, and to a large extent, the cognitive pistol stuff is us doing all that stuff. The only thing that I don't have time to do because of the infrastructure demands is the force on force and the Sims work. That is without a doubt the best way to build relevant mental maps for serious self-defense practitioners. The research, when one piece of research tells me something, I just don't get excited about it anymore based on the replication process or the
Mhm.
replication crisis. But dude, when multiple sources are telling me the same thing, that's probably a valuable data point.
Yeah, 100%. Dr. Fuller says, how much pushback do you get in the training community when you push the idea of you can shoot good enough, now work on decision making? Do you get a lot of pushback on that?
I haven't gotten much formal pushback because again, I'm totally cool with competition. Like I'm really excited. We had used to have a really good carbine match around here. It shut down due to some like internal range politics, and I'm signing up for the next, February 4th. I'm going to be shooting a carbine match because I think the competition is valuable, right? Um, I haven't gotten a lot of pushback because number one, I'm not trying to franchise. I'm not trying to do that. My classes, because of equipment and just logistics, I have a hard cap of 12. I almost have no problems finding 12 people that are interested in this material, and I've been able to pretty successfully fill my classes. I think I'm not saying I'm Louis Auerbach, but I want to fill his role in the industry. Louis Auerbach was a bit of a specialty instructor, and if you asked your firearms instructor after you completed a class, who do I need to go train with next? And eventually, some point you'd reach the point where you need to go train with Louis. And
Mhm.
again, at a certain point, I would like to be that guy. At a certain point, okay, you're shooting good enough. You need to go work on something else. Go spend a couple of days with Hearne. That's kind of what I'm looking towards. So,
Mhm.
most of the people that I've had in class, I've had very little pushback to what we're trying to do, because again, as soon as you get in that environment and you're having to make those decisions, we start out pretty simple, but when I get into the concept of there's what you need to do and there's when you need to do it, and those are distinct decision points, and making people work both of those at the same time. Um, one of my goals designing that class was to have a class that would have a lot of repeatability to it. And I think I've already had like one guy show up, for the 2 day class 2 years in a row, which I think is the highest compliment that an instructor can give.
Mhm.
So I haven't had a lot of pushback so far. I'm not trying to change the whole world as far as this stuff goes. I'm just trying to fill a unique niche.
What's the role of visualization, if any, in what you're doing, John?
So so visualization, to me, I'm thinking that is more of a mental map creation. The whole problem is teaching somebody to run a gun doesn't really prepare them to fight with the gun, right? The advantage of visualization is you can create a large number of pre-made decisions in your head. So like for instance, if you go to the same dry cleaners every time, right, to pick up your dry cleaning, look around that structure, memorize what it looks like, then go home and say, hey, what would an armed robbery look like in my dry cleaners? Where are the doors? Like, my dry cleaners, there's really only one public door. They would have to come in through here. Unfortunately, there's not a single bit of cover. It's like this little alley. Like, if somebody comes in for an armed robbery in my dry cleaners, That would be a time where, getting the gun out quickly and burning dude down is probably going to be one of the few options, unless you just opt to totally comply and hope for the best there. So the visualization to me is most important in creating the mental maps to allow you to have those pre-made decisions that you're really going to need carting around with you. Bill Rogers famously said, I think the exact quote is, "I'll figure it out when I get there," has killed more people than almost anything else,
Yeah.
right? You've got to have those pre-made decisions filed away in your head, and ideally have them based on your real world, not
Mhm.
in some tactical fantasy band camp where you're running around with ARs and plate carriers. I mean, if that's your job description, yeah, but a lot of guys will waste time doing that when they need to be worried about, what I want to say, like getting that Kel-Tec 32, which is the only gun they actually carry, figuring out how they're going to effectively use that, what is essentially an ear, nose, and throat gun in the real world to solve problems.
I'm cracking up because I got hurt my neck just agreeing with you right now. It's hilarious, but it's scary because a lot of people are like, well, I'll just see red, bro. Okay, well, go into your local jujitsu thing and see red, and let me know how that works out for you. Um, I want to get to Doug's comment. It says we have been using auto-facing targets more than the timer in order to teach our officers decision making with shoot no shoot targets. The way officers are making decision making based off visual cues instead of just using verbal threat commands or audible signal from the timer. I believe that this helps, and I have seen this. And I know Doug is an effective trainer. I love Doug, good man. I have seen this misused and abused. Um, I won't say the name of the law enforcement agency, but it's one of the largest in the country. It's in the top 5 of the largest in the country. Mike and I were doing a week-long course there, and the officers were like, "Yeah, this is what we're doing with recognition prime decision making." Rich, I'm like, "Okay, cool. Let's see it, brother." And the auto target faces, and the officer burns it down, and he does a scan process and reholsters. I'm like, "What the hell was that?" That was recognition prime decision making. I said, the target had his hands open. There was no threat. So what did we just, and this is what you're doing in your academy? Why, what was the go signal to shoot this guy? There was nothing. It was a humanoid silhouette target with open palms, and there was nothing, no reason this target should have been shot. And they're looking at me like I've got a third arm going out my forehead. It was just, they just could not understand it. And I'm like, man, this is one of the largest departments, one of the most well-funded departments in America. And we're doing stuff like this. It's like, what else is going on at the small areas, John?
And yeah, that's a difficult question, because so large agencies, once you get to a certain size, man, the logistics start to become really, really hard. So I have the advantage of, I'm putting 12 people in my class. I will have no more than 12 people because of the way the equipment has to work out. And quite frankly, if I wanted 16 people in the class, I'm driving everywhere for my cognitive classes. I think I could get enough gear in the truck for 16 people, but then I would need an assistant instructor, and that start become cumbersome, right?
Yeah.
Anything of scale. So there's certain things you can get away with in smaller niche areas. I'm drawing a blank on it, but there's a great quote by Jeff Cooper that I have on the wall in my office about how excellence is built one person at a
Hmm.
time, as
Hmm.
far as that stuff goes. So as you start to scale up these endeavors, it becomes harder and harder. I would say, that's at least better than nothing, at least if there was like a threat indicator on that target. But dude, just shooting because somebody has a gun in their hand is a very, very poor process.
Right.
One of the things I talk about is, using Paul Howe's decision making algorithm. As a person who walks around in public with a gun all the time, I'm not a fan of just shooting the dude with the gun. You
Mhm.
get these tragic consequences, like the concealed carry guy that, in Colorado, I think it's 2 years now. There, a bad dude with a rifle shoots and murders a cop in front of him. Right? He burns that guy down, and for reasons we don't understand, he went up and picked up the bad guy's rifle. Next responding officer has been told there's a dude shooting cops. He has a rifle. What does he do when he sees a dude with a rifle standing over a down cop? He just burns him down.
Mhm.
And part of what's so valuable about Sims is that you can make those decisions in context, right? That's a
Mhm.
split-second decision, which is, unfortunately, sometimes you have to make decisions that fast. But a lot of times our decisions are based on a larger environmental context. To bounce back to things we talked about. Um, Police officers make decisions quicker based on perceived degree of dangerousness, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Something as simple as, younger offenders are more dangerous than older offenders. That's what we see repeatedly. stuff. They'll judge dangerousness based on the time of call they're assigned to. So dispatching priming kicks in. The kind of clothing the suspect is wearing. The other thing nobody wants to talk about is just the neighborhood in which this stuff takes place. The missing part of what happened in Minneapolis was when you look at the city, the neighborhood data, that was in that neighborhood. I'm pretty sure Cups is in the 87th percentile for
Yeah.
safety, like as far as crime. So that was a high crime neighborhood occupied by gang members. The
Mhm.
police officers working that beat know they're dealing in a much more dangerous situation. They're going to be quicker to make that shoot no shoot decision in that environment than as opposed to an alternative lower crime environment when that goes to. So again, uh, making some kind of a quick no shoot decision is valuable. My friend Eric Gelhaus did that. We again start to see the value of ready positions. Certain ready positions work better for that than others. But again, training that with a little bit more contextual basis to give people information is going to be huge. What call are you dispatched to? It's like this. If you're dispatched to an active shooter and somebody gives you good information, it's a white male, he's got a green military coat on, and he's got a rifle. Okay, I can see making a quick decision based on that. It may suck to be the dude that brought their truck gun and was
Yeah.
wearing a green jacket that day, right? That's an understandable mistake. But I think that making those decisions with a little bit more environmental and contextual basis is definitely going to be more useful.
Yeah. And some people will chuckle, but on uh, my EDC firearm, I have reflective tape on the side of the slide, little red, white, and blue reflective tape on both sides and on the top, because I just want to slow that officer down enough. The responding officer, when he sees a middle-aged man with this weird thing with looks like a candy stripe on it. It does a couple different things for me, but I want to buy myself a half a second before he starts running that bill drill on me, because we all know how that goes. Brian says, Dr. Fuller, a lot, especially from the comp bro crowd, they do not like being told that having a B-class shooter skill is enough to prevail in even the gunfights that fall on the high skills needed spectrum. Don says, I do couples coaching, limit guests to 2. Yep. Small classes are definitely the way to go. Brian Horton says, Bill Armstrong, I'm praying for him since he doesn't have Weems and Gelhaus to carry on him in this podcast.
Carrying him on the podcast. Yeah. Doing the best I can, Brian. Thank you very much. I appreciate that vote of confidence.
uh, I've kept you on here an hour and a half, John. It's always a pleasure. We need to do this much more often. But tell me, because you alluded to some things that are coming up, man. I know you carry a crystal ball because you're just that kind of guy. What does your crystal ball tell you? 2024, 2025. Where is this country heading, brother?
Man, I don't know. I think that the potential for so I hate this like guarantees. There's no guarantees. But in the political climate we're under, I mean, things are kind of tense. Um, how do I say this? We can argue about the specific legalities of whether Donald Trump should have been excluded from the ballot in Colorado. But I think it's very easy to make an argument that as far as for general societal order, taking the option away from a lot of people that regard him as a relevant, realistic, appropriate politician is just not smart. The best thing I think you can do is leave the man on the ballot and let the people decide.
Yeah.
But those kind of decisions are going to be the stuff that either pushes, if he gets removed from a couple more ballots, that's just not good. It shortens the fuse on the powder keg as far as that kind of stuff goes. And again, the urban versus rural divide, I think is going to continue to, you know, raise its ugly head. That we know areas that are going to get, your self-defense stuff is going to be, excuse me, prosecuted very aggressively versus area where it's going to be more friendly. I'm not
Mhm.
trying to say that all you Californians need to leave the great state of California because, quite frankly, politically, that's already happened. The reason that
Mhm.
California is so in the shape it is if you look at, there's been a long-term flight from California for all the more right-leaning people.
Mhm.
So I think that the conditions, okay, I think you have a background. So like it's like a wildfire situation. If all the leaves are green, the humidity's high, we've had a lot of rain. That's a situation in which a devastating wildfire is a lot less likely to take place, right? But as you start to change that environment, as things dry out, as you get leaf litter falling and stuff like that, as you get, maybe storms coming in that can start a lightning fire, the circumstances which create the potential for catastrophe are more present. And that's what I think we're moving toward. I'm not, suggesting catastrophe is imminent. I'm just saying that the elements that make it more likely are going to be more present in the near future.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And that's the most responsible way of saying it, I think, because all the conditions are set. And even there was a CNN opinion piece this morning that said, and it was written from a leftist, not a liberal, not a Democrat, but a leftist. And he's like, big mistake for Colorado to do what they did because this is just going to make him stronger. And I agree with you. It's pushing people into Trump's arms because they see it. It's not hidden from anybody. It's out in your face that the Justice Department has been weaponized against a political opponent in the United States. This just did not occur here. We're close to the same age. I'm 54, you're 53. I've not seen this in my lifetime. If you were a Democrat back in the day, it's just like you like the Packers. I really don't give a shit. You were Republican, good for you. I'm more of a libertarian perhaps than anything, because as long as you don't hurt anybody or take their stuff, man, live and let live. But the division in this country is only going in the wrong direction. And to be honest with you, man, I worry about predictive programming. There's this new Civil War movie coming out in April, just in time for primary season. It's like, yeah, I don't know, man. I don't think it goes anywhere good, John. And I think that's what I'm hearing from you.
Well, and I think it's definitely not looking great as far as this kind of stuff goes. And the whole problem is, I mean, just we bunny each out everywhere else. Is I think there's a fundamental difference between being what we think of as traditionally liberal versus extremely left leaning. I had a hugely influential college professor that just died last year, and he was a dyed in the wool what you would think of as a liberal. He believed in free speech. He supported the ACLU, but
Mhm.
you know what he also believed in? He believed in rule of law. And that's,
Yes.
I think, the whole problem is that you have that far, you move from liberal to leftist where they don't believe the society is legitimate. If the
Yes.
society isn't legitimate, then the rule of law doesn't matter. The rule of law is just a tool used to oppress.
Correct.
And it's kind of like a fish that's been swimming in water their whole lives. These people that are calling for the removal of rule of law don't know what it's like to live without it. It's like that fish that's been in the water its whole time. And when it gets jerked out, it has no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
And the only reason that some of these people have been able to spout off, and I mean, some of the horrible stuff we've seen in reaction to October 7th and stuff like that, the only reason that these people have not been grievously injured and or slash killed, I'm not advocating for that, but that's the natural consequence of that stuff, is that rule of law still exists. As
Mhm.
that rule of law goes away, things are just going to get sketchier and sketchier.
Yeah, I agree. Those people that take your family on vacation to Somalia or South Sudan or some of these other places where there's absolutely no rule of law,
Oh,
stay there a
South
week.
Chicago. You don't have to
South Chicago.
travel internationally.
Exactly. Don't even need a passport. But my point is, uh, we know how those go. And it's like, oh, this is honey. This is awful. Well, what was the one thing keeping that at bay? It's the rule of law. And I'm going to kind of close, if you don't mind, John, with Dr. Fuller's point, because he's right. Bill Maher, traditional liberal, and now the leftists think he's a right wing stooge. Yeah. When I start agreeing with Bill Maher and everything he says is like, damn, you know, he hasn't changed. You know what I mean? It's what we used to think as a liberal is just shifting farther and farther to the left fringe. But anyway, that that really doesn't maybe have any bearing in a self-defense podcast like ours, but or maybe it does. John, what do you think?
You're just looking at the larger, because these self-defense incidents aren't isolated. They're taking place
Mhm.
within a larger culture milieu, right? You have to know where you are. A great example was we used to do a bunch of classes in Atlanta, and I don't know you how many counties and municipalities you went through around the Atlanta, but whether they gave you an award or an indictment for your self-defense shooting depended entirely on where you ended up geographically. So you need to be aware of that. And I'll just share one thing real quick since we mentioned South Chicago. I actually taught a class up in Chicago last September, and my host was a former medically retired Chicago paramedic, right? And I'm talking to him on the phone because I'm trying to get out of Chicago. So like I'm going to be out, like an hour out of the city by the time I stop for the night, so I don't have to deal with that traffic. And I'm talking to him on the phone. He's like, "Where are you right now?" And I told him where I was on the interstate. He's like, "Oh no, dude, no, that was a bad mistake." There are certain sections of the interstate because they are in that bad area between drive-by shootings, random stuff. He's like, the paramedics and the firefighters don't drive on certain parts of the interstates in our large national cities anymore. That's how bad that degradation is. The problem is Nobody wants to tell you that the firefighters and paramedics are afraid to drive on certain stretches of interstates in our large cities.
Yeah, and I saw where the police chief of San Francisco is no longer going to release mugshots because it paints, as to quote the gentleman, he said it paints black and brown people incorrectly. I'm like, so stats are racist now. I mean, we live in a clown world, and I just pray for our country, and I think that's all we can. Merry Christmas, everybody. Make sure you pray for your country, because I don't think it's heading in any place good. John, any final closing comments, and tell folks where they can train with you, sir?
Right. So I've been really bad. I'm actually in the process of leaving government service after 23 years full time, 31 overall. And I didn't have a bunch of leave on the books, and that's all changed, obviously. So I'm going to be in Austin, Texas at Carl Wren's place in January. The shooting class is long sold out, but the lecture's still available. Should have stuff up in just a couple of days. I'm going to be probably out in Salt Lake City at the end of February. I'm filling that calendar in. Of possible interest, we're just talking about the left coast. I'm actually teaching a Rangemaster instructor development class out in California in March. You can find that at the Rangemaster website. So I apologize for not having all the classes listed, but I have a bunch of stuff that we're just, we're like 95% there, and I just need to push them to Eventbrite. So, twopillarstraining.com or quite frankly, jhearne.eventbrite.com are going to get you those seats. The only thing that the Eventbrite doesn't get you is it's like, the seats for the Carl Wren class are sold entirely by him, so they're not going to appear there. But just keep an eye. I have a Facebook page, which is, of course, the algorithm is apparently suppressing. You actually have to like my page to get the feeds.
Shocking.
But every Monday I post a relevant study for our world. I share crime stories about how everything's failing. So follow the business page on Facebook. I'll post everything there as well.
And I've got links to a lot of John's stuff in today's show notes. So when you're done today, you can go and click on some of those links I've already put in there to train with John, because I love what John is doing, and any opportunity I have to give John a platform, I'm happy to do it. So thank you, John, for what you do to our community.
You are most welcome. I will show up and yell at the clouds with you any day.
All right, brother. Well, having said that, guys and gals out there, Warrior Nation, remember the fight is coming. Merry Christmas.